December's cold gripped the small town of Mill Haven, where snow blanketed the streets and muted the crunch of footsteps. A young woman named Jessa had moved into her late grandmother's house weeks earlier, lured by the promise of solitude during the holidays. It was a place where nothing remarkable ever happened, or so she thought. On Christmas Eve, Jessa wrapped herself in a thick sweater, sipping mulled wine as she tried to adjust to the quiet. The stillness was unsettling, stirring memories of long-forgotten winters spent here with her grandmother. Each creak of the house seemed louder in the absence of holiday chatter, and she couldn't decide if the quiet offered solace or a reminder of her solitude. Outside, a group of carolers appeared, their voices faintly harmonizing Silent Night. The melody was haunting, yet oddly inviting. She peeked out the frosted window. For figures stood beneath the street lamp, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. Curious, Jessa opened the door to thank them, but the song abruptly stopped. The carolers didn't speak. They just stood there, their heads tilted slightly, as though studying her. A chill crept up her spine. "Merry Christmas," she said hesitantly. The figures didn't respond. One of them, taller than the rest, took a deliberate step forward. Jessa shut the door and locked it, her heart racing. The carolers remained outside for hours, singing the same song on an endless loop. With each haunting refrain of Silent Night, Jessa's unease deepened. At first, she tried to dismiss them as persistent revelers, but the unbroken monotony of their singing began to gnaw at her thoughts. Her mind raced. Were they mocking her solitude, or was there a darker intent behind their persistence? The longer they sang, the more she felt the oppressive weight of their presence, as if the melody carried unspoken threats meant only for her. Each repetition of Silent Night seemed to gnaw at Jessa's nerves, their harmonious voices becoming an intrusive hum in the quiet night. Memories of her childhood Christmases, usually comforting, felt tarnished by the strangeness of the moment. Her grandmother's warm laughter and the safety of this home clashing with the unease growing within her. She found herself pacing the living room, trying to convince herself it was just a peculiar but harmless holiday prank. When Jessa finally dared to look again, they were gone, but something felt off. Footprints led away from the house, yet the snow beneath the window was undisturbed. A scrap of paper was tucked under her door. In shaky handwriting, it read, "We will come inside when you're ready." The rest of the night passed in a haze of unease. Jessa didn't sleep. She kept the lights on and a kitchen knife nearby. By morning, the note was gone and fresh snow had erased the footprints. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from just beyond the trees. The carolers never returned, but Jessa began noticing little things around the house. A chair moved slightly out of place, a door left ajar. As the days crept by, she realized she was no longer alone. It was only a matter of time before they came inside. Victor prided himself on finding the perfect Christmas presents. His past gifts were legendary among family and friends, a hand-carved rocking horse for his nephew that brought tears to his sister's eyes, a rare first edition book that earned a heartfelt hug from his father. "You always know just what to get," people would say, a reputation that Victor secretly relished. This year, he'd spent weeks hunting down a vintage toy train set for his young son, Sam. The set had been advertised as a collector's item, though the seller's insistence on cash payment and a deserted parking lot handoff had unsettled him. On Christmas morning, Sam tore through the wrapping paper with glee. "Thanks, Dad," he beamed, setting the train tracks in a perfect circle on the living room floor. Victor watched, relieved that the boys seemed oblivious to the chipped paint and faintly metallic smell emanating from the toy. Later that evening, Victor heard the train running in the living room, its rhythmic clattering oddly soothing. But as he walked by, he noticed Sam wasn't there. The boy was fast asleep in his room, yet the train kept moving. Victor leaned down to turn it off, but the moment he touched the engine, a sharp static shock made him jerk back. Over the next few days, Sam became obsessed with the train. He spent hours staring at it, his little hands never quite touching the cars as they circled endlessly. Victor started to notice strange things. Faint red stains on the tracks that wouldn't wipe away, a whispering sound that seemed to come from the engine when the room was silent. One night, Victor woke to find Sam standing by his bed. "The man wants to play," Sam whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "What man?" Victor demanded, but Sam only pointed toward the living room. Victor stormed downstairs, furious at what he assumed was a childish prank. But when he reached the living room, the train had stopped. One car was overturned, revealing something wedged underneath, a photograph of a boy who looked eerily like Sam, though the picture was decades old. Scribbled across it were the words, "He's mine now." In the sleepy town of Winthrop, nestled in the shadow of frost-covered hills, every Christmas Eve brought with it an old tradition, the ringing of the town's silver bell. Perched atop the steeple of the abandoned Trinity Church, the bell's somber chime marked the start of the holiday. For decades, no one questioned its origins. It was just another piece of history folded into the town's quaint charm. But for Claire Matthews, it held a darker fascination. Claire was a journalist, home for the holidays after years of chasing stories in bigger, noisier cities. Winthrop's quiet streets and warm, familiar faces were meant to be a balm for her weary mind, yet she found herself restless. The bell's story nagged at her, a whisper in the back of her mind that refused to be ignored. "It rings on its own," her father had told her over eggnog one evening. "No one's touched it since old Reverend Pritchard passed away." "That's impossible," Claire had replied. "Someone has to ring it." Her father shrugged. "They say it's the wind, but you know how people talk. Some say it's his ghost." The idea of the bell ringing itself was absurd, but the thought lodged itself in her brain. Late that night, long after her family had gone to bed, Claire found herself staring out her childhood bedroom window at the distant silhouette of the church. Its spire pointed sharply into the starless sky, a dark beacon against the snow. The next morning, Claire set out to learn more. She wandered into the local library, a musty relic of Winthrop's past. Behind the desk, Mrs. Edna Willoughby, the town's unofficial historian, greeted her with a knowing smile. "You're back, I see," Edna said, her glasses slipping down her nose. "Looking for another story?" "Something like that," Claire admitted. "I want to know about the silver bell." Edna's smile faded. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You should let sleeping dogs lie, dear. That bell, it's tied to bad times." "Bad times?" Edna hesitated, her eyes darting around as though the church itself might overhear. The year before Reverend Pritchard died, 3 children went missing. Some said well, you know how rumors are. But after he passed, the bell started ringing every Christmas Eve. "Did they ever find the children?" Claire pressed. Edna shook her head. "Not a trace." That evening, Claire couldn't ignore the weight of Edna's words. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes as she trudged up the hill toward Trinity Church. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air, the crunch of her boots on the snow the only sound. The church loomed before her, its wooden door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the faint scent of decay and mildew. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight as she scanned the rows of pews, each one warped and splintered with age. Her gaze was drawn upward to the bell tower. The wooden stairs spiraled precariously, each step groaning under her weight. When she reached the top, she found the silver bell. It was tarnished and cracked, its surface etched with strange symbols she didn't recognize. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal. A sudden noise below made her jump. It sounded like a child's laughter, faint and echoing through the empty church. Back at home, Claire couldn't sleep. She combed through old newspaper archives, piecing together fragments of the town's history. The missing children, Lucy, Peter, and Abigail, had all been last seen near Trinity Church. The search had gone on for weeks, but no bodies were ever found. One article mentioned Reverend Pritchard's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before his death. He had insisted the children were not gone but saved, though he refused to elaborate. Claire's skin prickled as she read his final sermon, a rambling diatribe about sacrifice and redemption. The next morning, Claire received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single piece of yellowed paper, the handwriting jagged and uneven. The bell rings for those who listen. Return what was taken. The note sent a chill down her spine. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and no one in her family admitted to leaving it. Who knew she was investigating the bell? Claire returned to the church that night, armed with a crowbar and a growing sense of dread. She forced the cellar door open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. The air was damp and suffocating, carrying the stench of rot. In the flickering beam of her flashlight, she saw 3 small shapes wrapped in tattered cloth. Her stomach turned as she realized what they were: skeletal remains, huddled together as though trying to shield one another. Near the remains lay a tarnished silver bell, smaller than the one in the steeple, but identical in design. Claire's hand shook as she picked it up. The whispers started immediately, soft and insistent, filling her mind with fragmented voices. As she emerged from the cellar, the large bell in the steeple began to ring, its sound deafening and relentless. Claire stumbled outside, clutching the smaller bell. Snow fell harder, blinding her as she ran down the hill. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. She tripped and fell, the smaller bell slipping from her grasp. When she looked up, she saw them, 3 children standing in the snow. They stared at her, their eyes filled with an ancient, unspeakable sadness. Claire fled back to her house, locking the door behind her. She placed the smaller bell on the table, staring at it as though it might come alive. The whispers had stopped, but the house felt suffocatingly quiet. She knew she couldn't keep the bell. It didn't belong to her. But returning it meant facing whatever force had tied itself to the church and those children. The next morning, the bell was gone. In its place was a photograph of Reverend Pritchard standing with 3 smiling children, the same ones she had seen in the snow. Claire left Winthrop the next day. The silver bell rang that Christmas Eve, its chime echoing through the hills. In the distance, the church stood silent and waiting.